Okay, so the other thing I have open here is the rock music timeline, and we're just going to start to follow this along each week. I'm going to use it just to kind of touch base and see where we are as we're moving through. The generation that had taken part in World War II, the parents of the baby boomers, were still listening to the crooners and the big band era, and the artists such as Frank Sinatra, Nat King Cole, and that sort of thing. Rhythm and blues charts are starting to cross over, and for the first time, white audiences are starting to hear music from African American artists. Helen Freed is one of the most important people in popularizing R&B music with white audiences. He's a disc jockey in Cleveland, Ohio, and he actually begins using the term rock and roll. Another important adaptation is the electric guitar, and now one guitarist can make as much noise as an entire orchestra of jazz musicians. And we start to have higher quality records that people can listen to. Here you can see the top selling singles in the 1950s, and you'll see that it is dominated by rock musicians and then some leftover crooners. You'll see Doris Day, Nat King Cole in here, but for the most part, Bill Haley, Elvis Presley, Fats Domino, Jerry Lee Lewis, and you'll see down here even more of them, begin to take over. So rock and roll has a relationship with popular music where it is both rebellious and popular at the same time. Getting to our fourth theme there, is it rebellious or popular? Well, it's rebellious, but it's also selling a lot of records. We like that rebelliousness. Similar to the way jazz was rebellious when it came out. Let's just step through some of the things that will be on the quiz and that are covered in the book. Again, we talked about R&B not being just directed at African Americans, but also now being played more on mainstream and pop radio, more white people listening to it. I disagree with the book on this, that rock and roll was not a new style. I believe it very much was a new style because of all these things that were brought together under one roof. Now, they came from other places, but it was something very new and very fantastic, and it burst on the scene in about 1 year. It was dominated by the baby boomers, okay? They were young listeners at that point, younger than any listeners had been before and that were marketed to before. Again, television was a very important part of this experience. We are in the height of the Cold War, and during this time, we start to have some of our first movements towards civil rights that are going to emerge in the 1960s. One of the important one for everyone in this class is the 1954 Supreme Court case of Brown versus Board of Education, which disallowed racial segregation in public schools, meaning we could all go to school. As I had said before, when we talked about that fourth theme, is it rebellious or is it commercial and produced versus personal? Rock and roll spans both of those things. It is, on one hand, it wants to sell lots of records and be mainstream, and on the other hand, it wants to take down the mainstream and do something new. That conflict is going to be going throughout rock and roll, and it gets passed on to hip-hop. Hip-hop has much of that same energy where it's simultaneously wanting to be marketable and rebellious. Helen Freed, again, that's a name you need to know. He is the DJ that really helped bring rock and roll and R&B music out into the mainstream. Freed believed so strongly in bringing together African American and white American artists that he had shows in which black and white people were interacting with each other. In fact, he was arrested for that, and in some part of the country was looked on very unfavorably. Finally, in the early 60s, Freed was taken down by a payola scandal in which he was accused and prosecuted for accepting money to play certain records. He actually died in a fairly young age. You can read about that there if you'd like. So Freed really influenced a lot of other DJs around the country who began playing this sort of music. And this distinction between this country R&B and pop charts starts to get blurred. Rock and roll is going to blur that distinction. It will keep doing that too for the next 50 years. Part of the rebellion, just like we have with hip-hop here, is that idea of white people incorporating more risque African-American approaches to things like sex and music. And so the kids are using a term such as rock and roll. If we listen to some of the songs like Bill Haley's Shake, Rattle, and Roll, there's terms in there like One-Eyed Cat, Peeping in a Seafood Store, which is about sex, not actually about a cat in a seafood store, but more square white American parents didn't understand that at the time. The 1950s really then became the invention of the teenager as someone you could sell things to. The idea that there was a culture of teenagers with enough disposable income from their parents, they could buy records, they could buy clothes, go to movies, was new, and it was very important. Today that seems odd because so much is marketed to us when we're teenagers. Early rock and roll relied a lot on covers, meaning that the artist would cover a song that was written by someone else or that had been performed by someone else. Again, we can look at the Hound Dog song that was covered by Elvis, even though it had been performed earlier by Big Mama Thornton. Now, how does this work? Well, back in the Tin Pan Alley days, we had a songwriter who would work with a publisher to publish sheet music. Then that music would get played by an artist. In the days before recording, the artist would simply play that music at a venue, and you had to have someone like ASCAP or BMI keep an eye on that venue to make sure that that artist or the venue was paying money back to the songwriter and the publisher. Well, then we started to be able to record these songs. So what happened? We ended up with a record company, and the record company and the artist now would produce a record, and they would sell that record and make money off it. Sheet music wasn't being sold as much, but ASCAP made sure that these people also paid back to the songwriter and the publisher any money that they made off this record. Okay, and then you also have radio playing them. And radio was supposed to pay money back to the record company and to the songwriter. So the artist and the songwriter, the publisher and the record company were different entities. And generally the artist and the record company were on one side of the coin, the songwriter and the publisher were on another. Well, this meant if I had a different artist, say I had Elvis Presley, and I wanted to record a song that had already been done, I could. And this, of course, this songwriter and publisher wanted me to record their song. They wanted as many different artists to record the songs as possible. When we talk about a cover song, this is what becomes very important, is that different record companies and different artists can record the same song. This still happens today. When you do a cover of a song, you have to pay that original songwriter and publisher, but you don't have to pay the original recording company or artist. If I recorded a song that Madonna had recorded, say Material Girl, which I don't think Madonna wrote, I would have to pay the songwriter who wrote Material Girl, but I would not have to pay Madonna. This pattern here allowed for more and more cover songs and was part of helping rock and roll really expand its influence. Okay, one of the songs I want you to listen to is Shake, Rattle, and Roll, and there's some dialogue in the book about that song. One of the things you'll see in this song is the AAB blues form. You'll see it here. Here's some of the lyrics that were actually recorded in the song, and you'll see there's line A, and line B. So it'll say something, repeat that something, and then some sort of hook that will close up the phrase. A couple of terms that are important for you to understand are a cappella and scat singing. A cappella means that there is no instruments playing, and scat singing is where someone is just singing nonsensical vocal sounds, not words like boop, bop, beep, dee, dee. That was used a lot in jazz, hasn't been used in rock and roll near as much, but it's something important that I'd like you to understand from the R&B and especially the doo-wop portion of R&B. The biggest artist in the 1950s was Elvis, and he's still the best-selling American artist of all time. He wanted to be a movie star, but he settled for being a rock star first and then became a movie star as well. He recorded some songs in Tennessee, and they quickly realized that he would have good crossover appeal, meaning he could appeal to R&B, country, and with his TV presence, popular music. These new artists that came in rock and roll were rebellious not only in their content and the lyrics, but also what they were doing to the industry. By the mid-1950s, the industry had really figured out how to do this pop thing, how to have Perry Como put out a big record and make a lot of money off them. And when these new bands started to be played, because rock and roll was so simple, almost anybody could start a band. And so what happened is these new artists were coming out in ways that the record industry wasn't prepared for. The major record companies that had been producing the pop star artists of the late 40s and early 50s fell behind when rock and roll came out. So one of the things that rock and roll introduced, one of the non-commercialized things, more personal, is that you could start a band and you could start even a record label and start selling records without having a large studio or a lot of commercial product behind you. Here's a picture of Bill Haley and his comments really kind of demonstrating the wild antics that would happen on stage with rock and roll. Again, we've talked about the electric guitar as part of the one of really important parts of rock and roll. Rock and roll is based on the guitar. That's the main instrument. The two most important guitar companies of the time were Gibson and Fender, and they still are some of the top manufacturers of guitar. And Les Paul was also very important in popularizing guitars. That the guitar was relatively simple to play compared to, say, maybe a clarinet was an important part of that rock and roll. Obviously, guitar can be very difficult to play too. Not all of us can do what Jimi Hendrix does. But most of us can pick up and start playing a few chords pretty early on, and if we plug it into an amplifier and distort it, it can sound very loud and appealing to a younger audience. And the person who popularized it the most and who really brought the guitar into its first important stages of development was Chuck Berry. What happens in the 1950s because of the developments in recording is that we no longer transmit the song as a written piece of music. The song we hear and what we think of is on that record. There's no reason to even write out the music anymore. This record serves as the recording, as the documentation of that song. And when we listen to it, we can't really separate it from the recording. When we hear these recordings from the 1950s, it's the same performance every time because it's a recording. There weren't a whole lot of different versions of Maybelline sold. The one that was put on the record was the one the record company produced and shipped out to its audience. And the idea of recording music surpassing live performance comes into play during this period. And that stays in fact probably until about 2010, after Napster comes out and the music industry, recording industry shrinks, and we see the festival circuit come back. So the start of the recording music industry is in the 1950s with rock and roll. The important artists on the more R&B side of rock and roll were Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and Fats Domino. I don't have you listening to any Fats Domino songs. I probably should because he just passed away last year. In fact, some of these guys are still alive. Not Chuck Berry, but Little Richard is still alive and still performing music. And one of my students went and heard Jerry Lee Lewis just last year in 2017. He was playing at Coachella. Chuck Berry is probably the most influential musician of the decade, not by selling the most records like Elvis did, but because he influences rock and roll from then on. Little Richard, as I talked about before, was the first kind of wild man of rock and roll, he and Jerry Lee Lewis. He originally had been involved in gospel music and popularized the piano as a rock and roll instrument. He and Jerry Lee Lewis were similar in that they would both play the piano. And really, the piano makes a comeback in the 1970s, but for the most part, rock and roll is going to be guitar-based after this point. What Little Richard does is bring in the idea of radical performance on stage, the idea of being rebellious and barely under control. And we like that. Rock and roll likes that. We'll continue that. We'll move into the 60s with The Who, where they start smashing up their instruments, and the punk movement of the 70s, and even the grunge music of the 90s. Fats Domino was a crossover artist from the R&B genre. His music is more smooth and probably, if we heard it, the least rock sounding of it. But he was one of the biggest record-selling artists of the decade by playing rhythm and blues, rock-style music for white artists. In fact, only Elvis sold more records than him. And you'll see here a picture of Fats Domino's band, and it's more traditional looking. There's a lot of horns and brass. There's still electric guitar over there on the left, but he has more ties to the past than some of the other artists. On the country side, we have the artists such as Elvis, and I've talked briefly about him. He uses more of a country twang in his music and yodeling, similar to Buddy Holly. You'll start to hear some of the technology developments in recording, such as reverb and echo, that make the voices sound bigger. Buddy Holly was maybe the Fats Domino of country music, meaning that his music wasn't as raw and aggressive as, say, Elvis Presley's music. It was more smooth, and he had a lot of country influences, such as twangs and hiccups and that sort of thing. And again, he really helped formulate the idea of the rock and roll band. Unfortunately, he died when he was only 22, a very famous event in 1959 when both he and Ritchie Valens died in an airplane crash. One important thing that Buddy Holly did was introduce the idea of double tracking. And what double tracking is when the singer records their voice once and then they record it again, and they play both at the same time. It gives it a fuller sound. You hear that sound a lot in the 60s with the Beatles, and then in the 80s, people like Madonna and the Police and that sort of thing use that double-tracked sound. So if you ever hear it's sort of like a harmony sound, but it sounds like two of the same person, that's what it is. It's two tracks of the same person. Okay, again, just to touch on the idea of that personal versus commercialized concept, rock and roll, though it's getting pushed by these record companies, the idea is that the artist and the songwriter start to become the same person. And really, Elvis is the only one of these artists that didn't do a lot of that. Most of the other artists became popular not just for their performance, but actually for the content of the lyrics and the songs that they were writing. We start to associate that. Rock and roll is the strongest genre that does that. There are fewer covers in rock and roll than probably any other genre. The person who writes the song and the person who records the song are the same person, and we grow to expect that. Now, one other thing that becomes important in all this, if we're producing a record right here, is someone needs to take care of all this. Someone needs to find this artist, a record company to pay them, a song written by a songwriter and a publisher, and help coordinate the recording of this record right here. That person is called the producer. And in the 1950s, we're going to see the emergence of the producer for helping develop records. You hear the term producer a lot now. It's changed a little bit in the last 20 years, but the idea is the producer is the coordinator or the manager or director of getting this record produced. And that wraps up what we want to cover from the book on this week's chapter in the 1950s.